Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Bob Duff from HockeyDebates.com, and this is the HockeyDebates.com podcast. And today, as we do every Thursday, we're talking about this week in NHL betting, kind of looking at some of the best bets and trends going on in the gambling industry relating to the NHL. As always, I'm joined by Hall of Fame writer Kevin Allen and Sasha Peruk, the head odds maker at sportsbettingdime.com. And technically, this weekend there isn't any official NHL games, I guess you could say, but there is the All-Star game. And I guess I'll start with you, Sasha. Is the All-Star game a big betting event, or do people have more common sense than to bet on an All-Star game?
It's not a huge betting event. There's not a lot of handle that either online or brick and mortar sportsbooks are taking on this event in particular, and that's generally the same across all sports. The one where you'll see the most action is going to be the Major League Baseball when it comes to the actual game itself. I don't have the betting statistics on hand in front of me, but I would guess that the biggest betting market period in terms of All-Star competition is probably the NBA dunk contest. But the NHL All-Star game, even in the format, is not something that generates a whole lot of betting interest.
Now, you've covered an awful lot of NHL All-Star games over the years, Kevin. It's certainly waned in terms of being a competitive event. Do you think this new format with the 3-on-3 tournament has helped that in any way to give it a little more oomph?
Yeah, I mean, it's improved, but it's still, not what it once was. I mean, I can remember the time because I was covering it when, the two teams actually competed to try to win. I remember a game in St. Louis where Mary Lemieux scored a couple of goals, and I don't remember the exact score, but it was like 5-4 or 4-3, and it was really a competitive game in the late 80s, and it was just a lot of fun. And then, over time, as there became players became more keenly aware about the dangers of playing exhibition games and so forth, that it just devolved into players just playing kind of shinny. And I still think it's a worthwhile event. I know some people are upset that there's no good competition, but it's kind of like the annual NHL convention. And everybody sort of gets together and talks about the issues of the game, and everybody's in a good mood, and everybody gets to draw a breath from the races, and the players who aren't in the game can, go off and relax. So I think it's still a worthwhile event, particularly in the cities, they get to host it. But with regard to competition and betting on it, other than I wondered if there was a MVP odds bet the 2016 when John Scott was MVP, because I got to believe he was pretty long odds to win it. And I wonder if somebody got a big payoff because big John Scott rolled in with the MVP award.
I mean, you talk about the MVP. I remember John Garrett telling me a funny story the year he was in the All-Star game. And he was only in it. He was Vancouver's goalie, but their number one goalie, Richard Brodeur, had been picked to the game. And he got hit in the ear with a puck and suffered a punctured eardrum right. I think it was the very last game before the All-Star break. And back in those days, the rules stated steadfastly that there had to be one player from every team. And, of course, being a goaltender, there was no other choice but to replace him with Vancouver's other goalie. And I think John had only been traded to Vancouver something like 4 or 5 days before the All-Star game. So I don't even know. I think he maybe had played one game as a Canuck, and all of a sudden he's representing him in the All-Star game. But then he goes in and stands on his head, and he's stopping everything in his half of the game. I had 2 goalies back then in the game, so he played a half of the game. And everybody starts saying, hey, on the bench they were telling him, you're going to be MVP of this game. You keep playing like that. And then in the third period, when he came back out for he had taken over in the second period, that was the game where Gretzky scored 4 goals in the third period. And he said every time back in those days, the prize was a brand new car for the MVP. And John said that every time Gretzky scored another goal, Lanny McDonald would skate back to the net and say, oh, he's got the bumpers. He's got the tires. There goes the engine. So.
I'll tell you, as president of the writers, I was involved in the voting for MVP. And when I took over, I decided to shrink that panel down because nothing changes so much as who's MVP in an all-star game. And, you vote with 10 minutes to go. And at that time, and the way the All-Star games have been going, there were 10 guys with 2 goals and an assist. Like it was just ridiculous. Trying to determine who should be, the MVP. So, basically what the writers decided to do was there'd be an initial vote, and then just in case there was a dramatic change, there'd be a new group, a smaller group, that would vote whether or not to overrule, depending on what happened in the last, 4 or 5 minutes of the game. Like, for example, Ray Bourque ended up scoring an overtime goal in Boston to win it. And, the voting beforehand, I'm sure with 10 minutes to go, I don't remember exactly because I wasn't present at that point. But, they held that vote, but, they held another vote quickly thereafter. And, of course, Bourque ended up being MVP because you want it to reflect what really kind of happened in the game. But it was really, really, now I think they do it by fan vote. But, back then it was really difficult to kind of determine. And, back then players were kind of ahead of their time. Like, the hot thing, I don't know if it's true in Canada, Sasha, but in the U.S. now, cooperative games, board games, communal effort to try to defeat a common foe are kind of hot. There's a bunch of them now that people play. I even saw that in Major League Baseball, it's pretty trendy even in the locker rooms to play these games. And that's what goes on with MVP. Once everybody gets a bunch of goals, kind of the group kind of decides, who we want to set up to try to get those goals so they can get the, MVP. Like that year John Scott won, it was pretty clear that the guys, his teammates, wanted him to be MVP, and they were really kind of setting him up. So it is interesting, but makes it pretty difficult to lay a bet down because that it's not the traditional competitive format that you're usually betting on.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. The motivation factor of All-Star games is what makes them basically complete stayaways for me in terms of betting.
I guess if you're desperate to make a bet on an All-Star game, and it seemed like when they first started going to the 3-on-3 tournament, the scores were coming down again. But last year, I think 2 of the 3 games, one team got at least 10 goals. So I would think if I had someone put a gun to my head and said, you got to bet on the All-Star game, my play would have to be the over on the total. It seems like that's the only logical bet I'd ever make on an All-Star game.
Yeah, if I was betting on the NHL All-Star game, first of all, I would get out my calculator and decide how much money I am perfectly happy losing. And I would probably wager on the team that had the longest odds. When they first did the 3-on-3 tournament, for some reason, I think just based on roster makeup, odds makers decided that the Pacific Division had a not considerably worse chance to win, but a worse chance to win than any of the other divisions. And they were the one outlier in the odds. And, they won the tournament because, as I said before, you have no idea how motivated these players are going to be going into it. And when you're talking about an All-Star game at the NHL level, the difference in skill between one group of All-Stars and another group of All-Stars is really pretty minuscule. So my betting approach for the All-Star game, personally, is not to put any money on it at all. But if you're an action junkie who absolutely needs to, I would, as I said, decide how much you're willing to lose. And then if you were giving me a free bet on it, I would just take the team with the longest odds if there is a difference this year.
Yeah, and I think it's hard to determine, too, if you're better. Like, there's a difference between talented players who can compete at the NHL level, and by that I mean, who can score in the heavy checking world of the NHL. And then there's another skill that allows you to be really good at shitty as well. That's different. Both groups, have skill in order to do what they do, but there's a big difference between the guys who can do it with guys draped all over them and the guys that can, just put on a show and practice. And those guys can, kind of excel in this format, which is a little bit different than a format where you got guys, essentially trying to kill you as you're trying to score a goal.
Yeah, I always wonder about guys like, for example, this year you've got Tyler Bertuzzi in the game, and Tyler Bertuzzi just, as you say, Kevin, he's not the kind of guy you think all-star, high-end skill. He's a guy that makes his living by being a pain in the neck and by going in front of the net and collecting the garbage and paying the price to get goals. So you just wonder, what's a guy like that going to do in an all-star game?
Well, I would just remind him that John Scott was an MVP and drove away with the car. That's all you need to know. And who knows? That's the point I guess I was making before. if John Scott's, or excuse me, if Bertuzzi's teammates decide that they'd like to give him a shot at an MVP, they can. They can try to set him up and get him organized and, try to make him look good. We've seen it before. Depending on where the All-Star game is, sometimes they try to help a favorite son be a star of the game. So that's part of the game within the game is what the players are trying to accomplish out there.
Yeah, maybe look at the team that has the most players who aren't on playoff teams.
Yeah. Well, that's where they should have had an over and under of how many guys would pull out of the All-Star game. You could set it at like 5, and you can bet over or under because there's usually a bunch of guys, and this year was no exception.
Is there even, Sasha, any action on the skills competition? Because it seems like that's the one event during All-Star Weekend where the players kind of give a little effort. Certainly there's a lot of attention on the shooting accuracy and, of course, the speed race. And are those things even that are worthy of thinking about betting on?
Well, at this point in time, you can't, as far as I know. There are no sports books that are offering any sort of props on the skills competition at this point in time. I wouldn't be surprised if in the next sort of 72 hours, we see at least fastest skater come up on the board once we know who the entrants are, for sure. But odds makers aren't going to make lines on events too often where they don't feel they have the sort of requisite knowledge to give themselves an advantage, or if they are going to, there's going to be an absurd amount of juice on the prop as a whole. So unfortunately, there's nothing out there at this point in time, but do keep your eyes open. I wouldn't be surprised if you see one or two.
No, we've talked a lot about games that don't matter in the standings, but since we're at the All-Star break, it seems like a good time to kind of step back and assess where we're at and who's kind of been a surprise for you this year, who's kind of, where they're expected to be and who's kind of in trouble. And we start with looking at the teams in trouble. I mean, let's talk about the Canadian teams. Toronto and Winnipeg, as of today, are both 3 points out of the playoffs. And, I'm sure if you look back at the odds, Sasha, at the start of the season, if there was a line on which Canadian team is going to win the Stanley Cup, it would have probably been, I would think, between the Leafs and the Jets would have got the best odds.
The preseason odds for Canadian teams to win the Cup, Leafs were definitely number 1. Number 2, I believe, was the Flames. I believe either Flames or the Canadians. Sportsbooks were actually relatively low on the Jets coming into the year because sharp bettors were relatively low on the Jets coming into the year. Their defense was absolutely decimated. Their sort of advanced analytics in terms of puck possession from last year heading into this year were not great. And so this sort of decline from the Jets was not unexpected. And expected goals for the Jets, their high danger chances are basically at the bottom of the league. They're ahead of Detroit in one category and they are dead last in the other. I forget which is which. So if I'm a Jets fan at this point in time, I'm not feeling too optimistic. You're basically where you're at right now because Connor Hellebuyck has played so well, and I don't think Connor Hellebuyck is going to keep playing so well.
What about the Leafs, Kevin? If you're a Leafs fan, should you be in a little bit of a panic stage right now? They certainly seem to get a spark of life when Sheldon Keefe replaced Mike Babcock behind the bench, but lately they're kind of looking like the same team that Mike Babcock was in charge of.
Well, that's for sure. There's always two kinds of trouble. There's where you can identify the problem like we have with the Leafs, or, there are teams sometimes when you can, something's wrong, but you can't put your finger on it because when you look at their stats, they kind of look like they're okay and then there's no one glaring weakness. And, I'd rather be in the Maple Leafs situation because you know what the problem is, but they haven't been able to fix it. This is a team that is defensively deficient. You can't win in the postseason without good defense, and you can't get into the postseason without good defense. And they really haven't corrected that. I suspect we'll see them make a pretty bold move at the trade deadline. I think, somebody's going to go, probably Kapanen would be my guess. And they're going to bring back someone who's, going to be able to help them defensively, be a stopper, as it were. But I don't know if it'll be enough because, the difficulty with their defense isn't one guy. it's a culture. It's, this team has not learned how to, play that style, and Keefe has not been able to do any more than Babcock did, and now they pick out the injuries on top of that. So I'm concerned that the Maple Leafs are not going to make the playoffs, just because that conference is pretty tough, and it looks like the Metropolitan is going to end up with the wild card teams.
Yeah, I like the Leafs to play well moving forward in the last half of the season, the last sort of 40% of the season here. But you're looking at the standings. They're 4 points out of the playoffs. Who are they going to catch? Which of these teams above them is going to regress? The obvious choice is Columbus. But Columbus has won 6 games in a row, getting fantastic goaltending, is incredibly well coached, is playing the exact opposite style of hockey as the Leafs, where they're incredibly sound defensively. And their sort of like basic shot stats, possession stats are not fantastic. But when you look a little deeper and look at the quality of chances they're giving up, they're not that sort of skewed in the opponent's direction. So I said last week, I'm not at all backing Columbus to make a run to the Stanley Cup playoffs. But if I'm looking at the sort of potential to hold on to what is a 5-game lead over the Leafs, albeit the Leafs have 2 games in hand in the back half of the season here, it's certainly not a question. And so even if the Leafs do sort of pick up their pace a little bit, you still have to leapfrog the Flyers and another team, and it's no guarantee whatsoever.
I think the only hope for the Leafs is to catch the Florida Panthers and get 3rd place in the Atlantic. I don't think they have a shot at a wild card. I think both wild card teams are going to be out of the Metro. It's a much deeper division than the Atlantic, and to me, Florida is a very similar team to Toronto. They weren't supposed to be. They went out and got a 2-time Vezina Trophy winning goalie who was supposed to give them world-class goaltending, and Sergei Bobrovsky has not this year. But they are like the Leafs, a little thin on defense, lots of scoring, and they played the Leafs last week. I think it was 8-4 was the final. So I think there's 2 teams that are kind of 80s throwbacks when you look at them, when you watch them play. But I think that's Toronto's got to focus on catching Florida, because I don't think a wild card's in their future. Now, I'd like to talk about who we think is our surprise team, and I'll start off. I'll give you 2. I'm going to go with the Bruins and the Blues, and you might say, well, how can you call 2 teams that played in the finals surprise teams? But how often do we see a team repeat? It happens occasionally, but not very often. Pittsburgh did it a few years ago, and before that, the only time I think in the last since 1984 that we've had 2 teams get back to the finals 2 years in a row was Pittsburgh and Detroit in 08 and 09. But you look at the way the Blues are playing in the West, and they certainly look like the best team in the West to me. I would think that Boston, they've not been as good lately, but they're still on top of the Atlantic, and they just seem to be a team that's built to win in the playoffs. So I wouldn't be shocked if we saw a repeat in the final of the same 2 teams as last year. Am I out of my mind, Kevin?
No, not at all. I mean, I think both of those teams have teams that are built to play well in the postseason. These are teams that are difficult to play against. These are teams that are pretty well schooled in the art of postseason hockey. They have all of the intangibles, and they have the qualities that are necessary to be successful. And I think in the case of the Bruins, they'll make a pretty big move here. The Blues could too, but I really expect the Bruins are going to go hard after Kreider, a Massachusetts native. They seem to get a lot of mileage out of bringing the boys home to play, as they did last season with Charlie Coyle, and getting them to play at a pretty high level. When you look at their roster, it's dotted with guys who really understand what it means to play with the B on your chest. So, there goes my dogs. I think that you're not crazy. I think that's a possibility that they could end up in the final.
What about you, Sasha? Who's your surprise team so far this season?
My surprise team for the good is the Islanders. I didn't think that they were going to repeat what they did last year, which they are doing for the most part. I don't really think they have the horses, or at least they didn't coming into the season. But serves me right for doubting Barry Trotz. And then my surprise team on the negative, and the team that I still would say, if I'm picking someone who's outside the playoffs that I think will make a run, now that's the team I was really high on coming into the year. I love their defense core. I thought they had a good group of forwards in terms of depth, but they were just getting such a little scoring up front. And Tekirene and Yusuf Saros are combining for the fourth worst save percentage in the league. So that's a pair of goalies that I do expect to regress for the better in the latter part of the season. And if they can do that, and if the sort of top six up front can pick up their pace a little bit, I love Nashville's chances. They are top 10 in the league in expected goals for percentage. But that's only going to be applicable. It's only going to matter if they can get better goals down the stretch here.
I'm hearing something out of Nashville that I never thought would be possible. I think PK Subban had sort of worn out his welcome there. I think from the national perspective, from the writer perspective, from the fan perspective, PK Subban is a lot of fun. From the teammate perspective, less so. Not everybody in the NHL, particularly players, appreciate that he is a bit of a showman and that he, is a guy that understands the marketing of himself and the league. So I don't think tears were shed when he was traded away from Nashville. But all of a sudden you're hearing, coming out of Nashville that this team really misses PK Subban. That, what made that defense, there's quality defensemen. Yossi is a Norris Trophy candidate. Ellis obviously is a player. They have Ekholm is a quality player, but they used to have Subban that sort of rounded out that group, gave them 4 high caliber defensemen. Now they only have 3, and I've now heard it said, from the Predators environment that they feel like the defense hasn't really been the same without that 4th, elite level defenseman that gave them separation from the other defenses in the league. And now they're just not the same. So I agree that they've been a big surprise from a negative perspective for me. They were going to be my choice as the team that's really kind of disappointed me because I expected them to do a lot more, and it just hasn't happened.
Well, I keep waiting like we did for the longest time with Tampa Bay, and then it finally clicked. Then I keep waiting for the same thing, the kind of the light bulb to go on in Nashville. But you look at their numbers, and they're just treading water. They're 11-9-3 at home, 11-9-4 on the road. They're 4-5-1 in their last 10. It's just they don't seem to be able to kind of find that ignition switch to kick it into gear. And they're running out of time. I mean, it's not out of the realm of possibility, but now they're 5-6 points out. That's a pretty tough gap to close in this day and age where there's 3-point games.
Yeah, and I will say the one thing working in their favor is that the Pacific Division has a lot of inter-division games still to play, so they're going to be beating up on each other to some extent. Only one team, as long as they're not going to be 3-point games, Nashville will have an opportunity. And they're getting healthier. Both Forsberg and Ulfridsson have missed time, so if you're looking for a reason to think that the offense will sort of kick into high gear here at some point in time, that would be it. But same point, maybe when they've been in the lineup and they've produced all that. Roman Josi is still the leading scorer. It's their second leading goal scorer. You've got 3 players with 14 goals or more. One of them is defense.
You look at the Pacific session, it's just you have 1 point between top spot and 5th place. You still see Vegas listed as the favorite in the betting lines to win the division. Who do you put your money on in the Pacific to end up on top?
The way the odds are right now, they've been adjusted pretty heavily in the last 10 days to the point where you've got all 5 of those teams, the Flames, the Canucks, the Oilers, the Coyotes, and the Knights, basically between plus 300 and plus 400. So odds makers really don't know what to make of this anymore. If I'm putting my money on a team right now, even though Vegas' odds generally are the shortest, ever so slightly, it's still going to be them. It's still going to be the Golden Knights. think that is the best team, and that's what the advanced analytics support. They have been by far, sorry, actually not by far, but they have been the unluckiest team in that division in terms of PPR combination, 8% shooting percentage. I'm pretty concerned that Marc-Andre Fleury's best days are behind him, but I look at the other 4 teams in that race and try to think to myself, which of these other horses do I want to ride with? And there really isn't one. And so the Pacific Division for me right now is sort of process of elimination. And the last team that I'm left with is Vegas, even though they have, all 5 of those teams are on 57 points, except for the Canucks who are on 58. Vegas played the most games at 52. So in terms of chances to pick up points, they have the fewest remaining. So I also think that they're still the best.
Who's your pick in the Pacific, Kevin? Should we believe in the Canucks, or are they going to?
I don't. I mean, I've been bullish on them moving forward, but I just didn't think they were ready for this season. I really think, maybe this is a bit of a flyer, but I really think Arizona is going to kind of rise up here. I think this is a team that believes in itself, and I think they feel like they have something to prove. And, they're not only, playing for themselves, but I think they understand the importance of trying to finally establish, some sort of winning culture, in this franchise in Arizona. So I think when you're going to merge all that together, and they have a quality coach, and everybody is kind of pulling for him, Rick Tocchet, and I think everybody likes the general manager. So, as I said, maybe it's a bit of a flyer, but I'm going to take the Coyotes to win based on the fact that, they're winning primarily with defense. And I think that's a little more easily sustainable than teams that are trying to win with, a lot of goals or with hot goaltending.
I'm going to kind of cross over to another sport here with kind of a goofy little anecdote sort of to end things here this week. I may have written the most bizarre story of my career earlier this week, but there's actually a Super Bowl prop, and we know there's been some pretty wacky Super Bowl props over the years. There's a Super Bowl prop this year on an over-under on how many women are going to claim during Super Bowl week that they slept with Jimmy Garoppolo. Now, I was trying to think, is there any hockey player that would ever have a wild bet like that on him? And I came up empty. The last guy I think you'd put in that category probably Derek Sanderson. But then, Sasha, could you ever see a bet like that during the Stanley Cup final?
Maybe now that Mike Rickards is retired, probably not. No first-hand knowledge of any of these things, just rumors, of course.
What about you, Kevin? Who would be what would be a crazy hockey bet like that we could see?
Well, I mean, obviously in years gone past, we've had some playboys that have been pretty well established. In the old days, of course, we had guys like Ron Duguay, who was dating models, and Ron Greshner ended up marrying a model in those days. But the modern players, Subban probably had the best sort of image, playboy image, if it were. But he's spoken for now with Lindsey Vonn. So I'm not sure there is one. I mean, Mike Modano's heyday, he would have been a guy as well. He was kind of known as a guy that always had a woman on his arm in major events.
Sean Avery making a comeback, anything?
Yeah, I don't know about that. I don't know if he fits that bill or not.
It's kind of scary to think of some of the props you could come up with involving Sean Avery. It's probably good just to not go there.
Yeah. Most of the guys who were, had that image. It was when they were, young and single, and most of them now are older and married.
Why is it that culture in hockey, Kevin? You talked about PK, and they kind of, they didn't really care for his kind of flamboyant, marketing of himself, branding himself. Why is hockey so against that when you see it so prevalently in other sports?
Well, I mean, I think it's just the culture, the belief that, you win through a team effort, and it's not a team effort if you're, you're worrying about, how you're selling yourself as a player. And it to players, it just doesn't feel right, that it's just not part of, hockey culture. But it's really too bad, because, what makes the NBA such a great league is the fact of all the, personalities that we've come to enjoy from NBA players. I mean, NBA players are not fearful of commenting on the politics or pop culture or anything else. They're they don't mind a little self promotion, and I think in the NHL that has sort of stunted its growth a little bit. Is that we're sort of lacking in the personalities. I think in the NBA you can probably put, I would say, 5 or 6 for sure, and maybe as many as 8 people in a headline, and people will read the story. And it's hard to do that in the NHL. Other than Crosby, maybe Subban, and I say maybe, and possibly every once in a while Ovechkin. But other than that, we don't have names that sort of carry a weight for a non-hockey fan to read a story.
Well, I mean, the perfect example, Sasha, was just this week. Zion Williamson's coming back from 2 months out, and it's the biggest story in sports. Sidney Crosby came back from 2 months out just about 10 days ago, and other than the hockey world, I don't think it registered with anybody.
Not much. Certainly weren't props on Sidney Crosby's ice time over/under in his first game back.
All right, gentlemen. Well, as we look at the clock, we are out of time. It's been another enjoyable conversation about the world of betting in the NHL, and we'll be back with you next Thursday. And Kevin and I will be with you on Monday to talk hockey in general. This has been the Hockey Debates podcast, and I hope everyone has a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks.